Hi, I'm Sarah and I'm 32 years old. I've been married for 8 months now, but it's safe to say my wedding wasn't quite the dream event I had hoped for. Not because of anything I could control, but because of the people I love. Or rather, the people who claim to love me. You see, when I got married, my parents and my younger sister, Emily, decided not to show up. And while I wasn't exactly shocked by Emily's absence, my parents not attending was a different story. Before we continue, I'd like you to drop a comment telling us which country you're watching from and what time it is. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss any updates. Your support means a lot. Now back to the story. Emily and I have never been close. I've always felt like I was living in her shadow, especially when we were growing up. She was the golden child in our family. She was tall, slender, and, in my parents' eyes, perfect in every way. She was always the center of attention, both at school and in our family. From the time she could walk, she was winning spelling bees, science fairs, and talent shows. She was valedictorian, prom queen, and everything in between. It seemed like there was nothing she couldn't do. Meanwhile, I was just me. I'm not tall or slender, and I never had that same natural charm that made everyone gravitate toward Emily. I worked hard, though, but it never seemed to matter. While Emily was celebrated for her looks and accomplishments, I was left feeling like I didn't matter as much. I went to college and got a degree in computer science, but that didn't seem to impress anyone. My parents always made it clear that Emily was the one they were truly proud of. My mom used to make cruel comments about my appearance. She'd tell me how much better I would look if I tried harder to be like Emily. Eventually, I learned to ignore those comments, but they still stung. It wasn't just about looks either. It was everything. Emily was the one who was good at everything, and my accomplishments, no matter how hard I worked for them, always took a back seat. The hardest part? They didn't even try to hide it. It was as if I was invisible, and Emily was their shining star. As the years went on, I stopped trying to gain their approval. I stopped trying to impress them because nothing ever seemed good enough. Instead, I focused on building my own life. I grew professionally, built relationships with people who valued me for who I was, and learned to stop caring about what my parents thought. I stopped seeking their approval because I realized I'd never get it. My parents were only interested in maintaining the perfect image of their family, and I didn't fit that image. That's when I met Mark. We met at a computer conference through a mutual friend. Mark was different. He saw me for who I was, someone who was passionate about coding, had a dry sense of humor, and didn't fit into a box that my family would have approved of. He liked me just the way I was. We started dating, and after 4 years together, he proposed. It was perfect. I didn't expect anything big or extravagant, but when I told my parents I was engaged, their reaction was nothing. There was no excitement, no congratulatory words, just silence. My mother questioned whether I was sure about getting married and even suggested that I might want to improve my physical condition before the wedding. Honestly, I was used to her comments by then. It was just another reminder that, in her eyes, I was never enough. My father barely said anything at all, and when we had an engagement party, they spent most of the time talking to Emily on the phone in a corner. It was all a bit much to process, but I didn't let it get to me at the time. I figured they were just being their usual selves, and I tried to focus on what was supposed to be a happy occasion. The worst part, though, was when we started planning the wedding. My mom, who had already been planning everything for Emily's wedding, despite Emily not even being engaged, wasn't interested in helping me. When I picked out my wedding dress, she told me that it was practical and suitable for my figure, but she didn't seem to care. In fact, it was my future mother-in-law who stepped in to help me plan the wedding. She was the one who cared. She was the one who treated me like her own daughter. Mark and I did everything ourselves, sending out invitations, choosing the venue, finalizing the details. I was certain I sent invitations to both my parents, yet they claimed they never received them. I had proof they did, read receipts for the emails and delivery confirmations for the physical ones. But when I tried reaching out to them, I got evasive responses. They told me they were too busy to RSVP. In the midst of all this, I couldn't help but feel the absence of my parents. They weren't just missing from the wedding, they were missing from my life in so many ways. On the wedding day, everything went beautifully. It wasn't grand or flashy, but it was perfect for us. It was intimate, with a laid-back ceremony and a lovely reception afterward. The absence of my parents stung, though, and I felt it most during the father-daughter dance. I couldn't help but notice the empty seats in the front row where they should have been sitting. The absence of my family was almost painful, but we carried on. Mark and I were so in love, and that was enough. After the wedding, I tried to reach out to my parents. I wanted to know why they hadn't come. They claimed they hadn't received a formal invitation, which was a blatant lie. When I confronted them, my mother gaslighted me, claiming I must have made an error in sending out the invitations. It was all just another way to avoid taking responsibility for their actions. Later, my husband pointed out how my parents had been dismissive of everything I did, from my engagement to the wedding. They couldn't even pretend to be happy for me. To them, the idea that I, the lesser daughter, was getting married before Emily was too much to bear. My wedding, a day that should have been about celebrating my love, had been hijacked by their obsession with appearances. I began to realize that my parents weren't just rejecting me. They were rejecting everything that didn't fit into their perfect, manufactured image of what family should look like. And Emily? She was a part of that image. The months went by, and as I settled into married life, I tried to move on from my parents' absence. I focused on what truly mattered: Mark, my work, and building the kind of life I always dreamed of. A life where I wasn't constantly being compared to my sister. But no matter how hard I tried to forget, the reality of my parents' actions kept creeping back into my thoughts. They didn't just skip my wedding. They made it clear that my life was always second to Emily's. It hurt. It hurt a lot more than I wanted to admit. But over time, I started to realize that it wasn't my fault. It wasn't because I wasn't good enough. It was because I was never going to measure up to the version of perfection they had in their heads. Then, about 3 months after my wedding, things took a strange turn. Emily, of course, was getting all the attention again. She had gotten engaged a year after me, and everyone was already buzzing about her upcoming wedding. My parents were absolutely thrilled. You could see it on their faces. The excitement was written all over them. Finally, their golden child would have the perfect wedding they'd always dreamed of. My mother was already planning every detail. She was booking venues, talking about dresses, and trying to control every aspect of Emily's wedding, the way she had always done with her life. I found out from some extended family members that my parents had been telling everyone how happy they were about Emily's engagement. They were already planning a grand event, one that would undoubtedly be far more extravagant than my own wedding. To them, it wasn't just about celebrating Emily. It was about maintaining the image of the perfect family that they'd carefully crafted over the years. I couldn't help but feel this tight knot in my stomach every time they'd bring it up. My parents hadn't attended my wedding, and now they were throwing everything into Emily's, as if my own wasn't even worthy of their attention. But I wasn't surprised. I had long since stopped expecting any different. Still, it stung to know that they'd never even acknowledge what I went through on my wedding day. The pain of their absence, and the way it felt like they were saying I wasn't worth celebrating. It wasn't long before things between Emily and me started to take another twist. She wasn't just content to enjoy her moment. She had to make sure that everyone knew her wedding was going to be the best, better than mine. She didn't just want a wedding, she wanted to outdo me. The passive-aggressive comments started, and at first, I tried to brush them off. But it was hard when she started to get more involved in the drama than I had expected. Emily sent me a message a few weeks ago that rubbed me the wrong way. It wasn't what she said. It was the tone. She claimed she wanted to help me understand why I had acted the way I had during my wedding planning. She told me that she understood I was insecure and that my wedding wasn't as extravagant as I had hoped. She tried to make me feel guilty for how I handled my own wedding. It felt like she was lecturing me, as if I were still the child who needed to be taught how to behave. I was done with it. Her words were coded in that same condescending tone she'd used my whole life. She made it clear she wasn't just concerned about me. She was trying to control me again. "You can't just blame Mom and Dad for being bad parents," she wrote. "They've always done everything for us. Why should they act differently just because of your wedding?" I didn't respond. Honestly, I didn't see the point. No matter how much I wanted to, I knew interacting with Emily only gave her more ammunition to make me feel worse about myself. It had always been this way. She would say something hurtful, and I would try to defend myself, but it was never enough. So I blocked her number. That's when things started to spiral. I had no idea just how far she would go to keep up her control. Mark called me at work the next day, and Meredith barely able to speak because he was laughing so hard. It turned out that Emily had reached out to him instead. She didn't get a response from me, so she decided to go around me, thinking she could manipulate Mark the same way she had always manipulated everyone else in our family. The message she sent him started off somewhat polite. She pretended to care about our family dynamics and tried to sound like she was doing it out of concern for me. "As Rebecca's sister, I feel it's important to reach out to you about this," she wrote. "But I do think it's time you helped her understand the bigger picture. Our family has been through so much, and she's acting out because she's insecure about everything she's done in life. She needs to stop trying to destroy this moment for everyone else." Her message was filled with subtle jabs, as always. She pretended to be concerned, but was really just trying to paint me as the problem. What she didn't know, though, was that Mark saw right through her. He wasn't fooled. He responded in the calmest, most collected way, not letting her words get to him. He simply said, "Thank you for your concern about Rebecca's well-being. As her husband, my job is to support her happiness, not manage her behavior. I think it's best if you direct any future concerns to Rebecca directly. Have a nice day." When Emily didn't get the response she wanted, she sent one final message. This time, she was furious, accusing Mark of siding with me and making it clear she was upset that we were choosing to live our lives without her approval. "I see you've poisoned him against the family, too," she said. "Don't say I didn't try to help when this all blows up in your faces." Mark and I laughed. I couldn't even be mad anymore. It was like watching a child throw a tantrum because they didn't get their way. Emily's control didn't work on us anymore, and that realization felt empowering. It was as if the years of frustration, of trying to live up to an impossible standard set by my family, were finally coming to an end. What amazed me even more was the way her behavior had finally brought Mark and me closer together. He had always been my rock, but seeing him stand by me so confidently only made me more certain that I didn't need to play the game anymore. I didn't answer Emily. It wasn't worth the energy. But my decision to block her set off a chain of events I wasn't expecting. A few days later, I found out she had tried to manipulate me in a new way. Emily had gone directly to Mark, trying to twist things in her favor, and when that didn't work, she turned to her usual game, guilt-tripping and manipulation. But the truth was becoming clearer to me than ever. I'd spent so many years doubting myself, wondering why I wasn't good enough. But now I saw things clearly. I saw Emily for who she really was. Someone who used people to elevate herself. Someone who felt the need to control everything around her to maintain her image of perfection. I wasn't going to be a part of that anymore. This wasn't just about my wedding. It was about everything I'd put up with for my entire life. The constant comparisons, the criticism, the feeling that I was always second best. These were the things I'd been fighting against for years. But now I was done fighting for their approval. I didn't need to play that game anymore. Emily's attempt to manipulate Mark had backfired. If anything, it had made us stronger as a couple. Instead of dividing us, it brought us closer together. We laughed about it, joked about her ridiculous attempts to control everything, and planned a weekend trip to get away from all the drama. At that moment, I realized something important. Family isn't about keeping up appearances. It's not about pleasing everyone or making them happy by playing by their rules. Family is about support, love, and understanding. It's about standing by each other, no matter what. And I was done with the toxic dynamics that had been plaguing my family for years. I've learned so much through this process. The most important thing I've learned is that true success isn't about impressing others. It's about being true to yourself and finding happiness without needing validation from people who will never see you for who you truly are. And as much as I wanted my parents' approval, I was beginning to realize that I no longer needed it. As time passed, I thought the worst was behind me. But as you might guess, it wasn't. Things continued to unfold in ways I hadn't anticipated. The reality of my parents' rejection became even more evident, and I realized something else that was truly painful. I wasn't just dealing with a few isolated incidents. This behavior had been ingrained in them for years. After I blocked Emily, I decided I wasn't going to let her or my parents have any more power over me. I wasn't going to let them dictate my happiness anymore. But they weren't done. They started trying to repair their image again. My parents, particularly, were desperate to fix the story they had spun about me. They wanted to convince everyone that I was the problem. They started calling relatives, spreading lies, and accusing me of being envious of Emily and her upcoming wedding. They claimed that I was only spreading false stories about them because I couldn't accept that Emily's wedding would be better than mine. According to them, I had purposely excluded them from my wedding to play the victim. It was a ridiculous lie, but I wasn't surprised they tried to turn the tables. What hurt was how they manipulated the truth. They were so determined to keep up their perfect family image that they couldn't even face the reality of their actions. The truth, in their minds, was inconvenient and too messy to deal with. But the more they tried to hide it, the more it came to light. Through family ties, I heard that my parents were telling relatives how I had supposedly mistreated them, and that I was jealous of Emily's wedding. They were telling people that I had sent their invitations to the wrong address. And that was where the cracks in their story started to show. It wasn't just the lies, they were starting to unravel. My relatives didn't buy it. The funny part was that my parents still lived in the same house they'd lived in for decades. They still had the same email addresses. They were trying to convince everyone that I had sent the invitations to the wrong address. But I knew, and deep down everyone else knew, that wasn't true. More relatives started to speak up. Some of them shared stories of how my parents had treated them over the years, how they had always played favorites. One aunt told me that my mother had done the exact same thing at family weddings before, making sure Emily was the star of the show, overshadowing everyone else. It was the same pattern, over and over. And that's when things really started to shift. People began to speak out. They stopped turning a blind eye to my parents' manipulation and favoritism. They didn't side with me just out of sympathy. They sided with me because they were finally seeing my parents for who they really were. They saw the truth behind all the lies my parents had been spinning. It was like a domino effect. My parents tried to control the narrative, but they only dug themselves deeper. And the more they tried to save face, the more people started pulling away from Emily's wedding. It was a little poetic, honestly. For once, my family was seeing the truth, and I wasn't even the one telling it. I didn't have to say anything because my parents' actions spoke louder than any words I could have used. As for Emily's wedding, that became a whole other issue. Relatives who had originally planned to attend her wedding began backing out. A few of them didn't even explain why, but the message was clear. My parents' desperate attempts to fix their reputation had backfired. People weren't interested in being part of their perfect family facade anymore. As things began to unravel, I couldn't help but feel this strange sense of relief. I knew it wasn't over, not by a long shot. But seeing my family's reputation start to crumble was like a weight being lifted off my shoulders. For years, I'd struggled with this idea of needing their approval. I had fought to be seen, to be loved, and to be acknowledged. And now I was realizing that I had spent too much time chasing something that was never going to happen. I wasn't the problem, they were. A few days after Emily's failed attempt to manipulate Mark, things took another unexpected turn. This time, it was my parents who came to me, trying to fix what was left of the situation. They started reaching out to me, calling and sending messages. They accused me of being spiteful and of trying to ruin Emily's wedding. They blamed me for the mess they had caused, claiming I was poisoning people's opinions about them. It was all very typical. They didn't want to take responsibility for their actions. They didn't want to face the truth. They just wanted to preserve the image of a perfect family, even if it meant hurting the people who loved them most. In their minds, everything I had done, everything I had said, was a direct attack on them. They couldn't see past their own egos to understand how deeply their actions had hurt me. They couldn't see how their refusal to acknowledge their mistakes had driven a wedge between us for years. When I finally did speak to them, it was like a dam had broken. All the years of pent-up frustration, all the hurt, all the things I had kept inside, finally came out. I told them how I had felt all my life. I told them about the countless birthdays, achievements, and moments where Emily got the praise and the spotlight while I was left in the background. I told them about how their favoritism had shaped my entire childhood and how painful it had been to see them pour all their energy into Emily's wedding while ignoring my own. The way they responded told me everything I needed to know. Instead of acknowledging their faults or apologizing, they deflected. They accused me of exaggerating everything. My mother said, "Why didn't you speak up sooner?" As if I hadn't spent years trying to tell them how I felt. But in that moment, I finally realized something important. They would never change. No matter how much I tried to explain myself, they were never going to hear me. They were so consumed with maintaining their perfect family image that they couldn't even see the damage they had caused. And that was when I truly let go. I didn't need their validation anymore. I didn't need to keep chasing something that was never going to happen. For the first time in my life, I stopped apologizing for how I felt. I stopped trying to fix a relationship that wasn't broken because of me. It was broken because they refused to see me for who I was. When the conversation ended, I didn't feel the pain I thought I would. Instead, I felt relief. I felt free. I had said everything I needed to say. I wasn't going to beg for their approval anymore. I wasn't going to play their game. Later that evening, Mark and I sat outside on the porch. I was watching the sunset, reflecting on everything that had happened. I felt a sense of peace wash over me. Mark came over and held my hand, and I couldn't help but ask, "Do you think they'll ever change?" Mark looked at me, squeezed my hand, and said, "No, but you have." And he was right. I had changed. I wasn't the same person who was desperate for my parents' love. I wasn't the same person who felt like I had to prove my worth. And that, to me, was the biggest victory. Over the next few weeks, things continued to unfold, and I began to realize just how much my silence over the years had played a role in everything that had happened. I had spent so much time trying to keep the peace, to be the good daughter, the good sister, the one who always kept quiet and let the situation unfold without creating conflict. I kept telling myself it was just easier that way. But in the process, I allowed my parents and Emily to continue their harmful behavior. By not speaking up, I had silently condoned their actions. Mark saw this too. He told me that over the years, my parents had created this perfect family image, a facade they had been building for so long. And while it had looked perfect on the outside, it was entirely based on emotional manipulation, favoritism, and the need to control everything. Mark said it best when he pointed out that eventually, it was all going to fall apart. The truth had a way of coming out, no matter how hard they tried to hide it. For the first time in years, I felt a huge weight lifted from my shoulders. I didn't have to worry about trying to win my parents' approval anymore. I didn't need to continue trying to be someone I wasn't just to make them happy. I stopped thinking about how to please them or make everything perfect in their eyes. That stress of constantly trying to control Emily's emotions, of always trying to stay on her good side, finally faded. It was gone. I realized that sometimes the best way to retaliate against people like my parents and Emily was to stop playing their game. The truth didn't need me to manipulate it. It didn't need me to craft some big emotional speech or do something grand. All I had to do was let it speak for itself. And that was exactly what I did. I stopped responding to Emily's messages, I stopped trying to defend myself to my parents, and I let them take responsibility for their own actions. I didn't need to say anything anymore because the truth was so much more powerful than anything I could say. One of the best decisions I ever made was when I went online and posted my story. I never expected it to be something I'd share with strangers, but doing so gave me the courage to really stand up for myself. The The support I received was overwhelming. People, strangers, rallied behind me, offering advice and encouragement. Some even shared their own similar experiences. It was incredibly validating to see that I wasn't alone. The community on Reddit helped me more than I could have ever imagined. Reading the supportive comments, I realized that sometimes true family support doesn't come from blood relatives. It comes from people who understand you, who see the truth, and aren't afraid to tell it. These were people who supported me without the baggage of family dynamics and expectations. They didn't have a preconceived image of who I was supposed to be or how my life was supposed to look. They just saw me as I was, someone who deserved better. As I reflected on everything that had happened, I felt gratitude. I was no longer stuck in a toxic cycle of emotional manipulation. I could finally breathe again, and that felt like true freedom. Looking back on my parents' desperate attempts to fix the narrative, I saw how futile it all was. The more they tried to cover up the truth, the more they revealed about themselves. They weren't fooling anyone, and I wasn't buying it anymore. All their efforts to preserve the perfect image they'd built were unraveling, and they couldn't stop it. For the first time in my life, I wasn't concerned with upholding their image. I didn't care about their version of the perfect family. All that mattered was my own happiness. I had come to accept that the only way I could move forward was to stop letting them control my emotions and my life. They had made their choices, and now I was making mine. I was finally free. Free from the guilt, the hurt, and the constant need to prove myself to them. As things continued to evolve, I realized the truth was becoming my greatest ally. While my parents tried to salvage their image, it was clear to everyone around them that their actions had caught up with them. The more they tried to justify their absence from my wedding, the more they exposed the dysfunction in our family. I didn't need to say a word anymore. Their behavior was speaking for itself. I had come to terms with the fact that my parents would never be who I needed them to be. And though it was painful to let go of that hope, it was also incredibly freeing. I no longer had to beg for their approval. I no longer had to try to meet an ideal that wasn't mine to begin with. The most important thing I learned was that true success isn't about impressing people or maintaining some perfect family image. It's about finding peace within yourself, accepting who you are, and surrounding yourself with people who lift you up, not tear you down. As for Emily, well, her behavior was predictable. She tried to pull Mark into the drama, but he stood firm, supporting me all the way. We both agreed that we were done with the family games. We laughed off her attempts to manipulate us, realizing that her insecurity was the real issue, not anything I had done. It was almost laughable how far she would go to try to control everything. Now, Mark and I focus on building our own happiness. We're creating our own family, one based on love, respect, and mutual support, not on appearances or manipulation. I've stopped worrying about what my parents think, and for the first time in my life, I feel truly free. I'm no longer the second daughter. I'm Sarah, and that's all I need to be. Looking back, I'm grateful for the lessons I've learned. I don't need anyone's approval to know that I'm worthy. I know my worth now, and that's the most important thing. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. I'd love to hear your thoughts, so leave a comment below. What did you think of the story? And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, so you can stay updated on all the latest content. Hit the notification bell so you're the first to know when a new video drops. Thanks again for your support, and I'll see you in the next one.